The noise in the airplane cabin gradually subsided. The passengers settled into their seats, adjusting to the long flight. At first glance, everything was business as usual. Welcome announcements, smiling stewards, the flickering light of the security board. But this flight promised to be different. At the boarding gate, she had already attracted attention. An elderly black woman with an aristocratic posture and shrewd eyes was walking slowly down the aisle. She was carrying a small but heavy-looking bag. Some of the passengers squinted. Her presence, as if causing awkwardness, could be felt in the air. When the woman reached her seat, she tried to lift her bag into the baggage compartment over her head, but the effort was futile. Her voice, quiet and shaky but full of dignity, turned to the nearest steward. "Excuse me, young man, can you help me?" The steward, a young and cocky man, was busy checking something on a clipboard. He looked up, quick, appraising, and frowned when he noticed her. His irritation flared instantly, as if the request itself were inappropriate. "Madam," he replied dryly, barely concealing his impatience. "You should have thought about it beforehand. Please place the bag yourself or ask the other passengers." The woman was embarrassed but remained calm. She looked at him with a slight reproachful expression. "I'm sorry, but I'm having a hard time. I was just asking for a little help." But his tone was becoming increasingly harsh. "If you have a problem with your luggage, you should have checked it in. We're not here to solve your problems." Her calmness and restraint only added fuel to the fire. He could feel his irritation growing. There was something in her unyielding dignity that displeased him. Other passengers began to turn around. There were whispers. Some were already pulling out their phones, anticipating the spectacle. The woman was silent, but her gaze spoke more than words. That look made him feel as if she could see right through him. "I'm sorry if I'm an inconvenience," she said, averting her eyes. "But perhaps one of you could help me?" She turned to the passengers, ignoring the steward. Several people jumped up, but the steward raised his hand as if imperiously demanding attention. "This is my area of responsibility. I decide how the rules will be enforced. Please take your seat and follow the crew's instructions." The awkwardness was getting worse. The atmosphere became oppressive. Without another word, the woman sat back in her seat, holding her bag in her lap. But her silence, her dignity, cut at my nerves as if it were an unspoken judgment. The steward looked back at her with a cold stare for another long time, not knowing that this encounter would be the beginning of the biggest mistake of his life. The airplane cabin fell into a tense silence. Passengers furtively glanced at the elderly woman, who seemed to be trying to draw as little attention to herself as possible. But her calmness irritated the steward. She was not living up to his expectations. Her gaze, incorruptible and yet full of pain, said more than words could express. A young steward stopped abruptly beside her row, pretending to check her seat belts. His voice, scathing and icy, broke the silence. "Are you, madam, breaking the rules again? I've already explained that luggage should not be on your lap. Remove it immediately. This is flight safety." The woman looked up. There was fear in them, silent, suppressed, but clearly recognizable. She knew that her words, her actions, could only make the situation worse. But she was not going to give up. "I'm sorry, but I'm holding the bag because it's too heavy for the overhead compartment. I'm afraid I won't be able to handle it." These words, spoken softly and discreetly, seemed to explode something inside the steward. He raised his voice so that everyone could hear. "Are you afraid? Well, you should have been afraid before, when you brought that thing. This is no place for your whims. You're endangering other passengers." At that moment, the tension in the cabin became almost palpable. Someone whispered, someone looked away, feeling uncomfortable. The woman clenched her hands on her bag as if it were her last support. Her gaze, full of fear and humiliation, slid over the faces of the passengers, hoping for support. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "but please be a little more polite. I'm just asking for help." These words only fueled the steward's anger. More polite? He almost laughed. "Do you need more respect? Do you, madam, respect the rules? Or do you think they don't apply to you? Do you think you can behave as you please because you're used to it?" Subtle innuendos imbued with racist overtones hung in the air. The woman flinched, but didn't say a word. She knew that any objection she made would only be an excuse for further attacks. "This is unacceptable." A man from the next row raised his voice. "Why are you talking to her like that?" The steward turned around, his face flaring with irritation. "I'm doing my job, sir. If you don't like it, you can complain after the flight. But right now, I'm in charge of order on board, and I'm not going to let anyone, to disrupt it." The man fell silent, but did not avert his gaze. Several other passengers began to whisper louder. The woman sat silently, clutching her bag. Her eyes glistened, but she held back tears. Her humiliation, her pain, her fear. It was all visible, but nothing was done. The steward turned to her again. Now his voice was almost sarcastic. "If you can't handle the simple rules, maybe you shouldn't be flying at all. Maybe you should get off the plane right now." Those words, spoken in front of everyone, pierced her. She tried to say something, but the air seemed stuck in her lungs. Everyone looked at her. She felt the heat of resentment and shame sweep over her face. Time seemed to stand still. She didn't know what awaited her next, but she knew one thing. She was all alone in this struggle, or, while it seemed that way. The airplane cabin was frozen in an oppressive silence, broken only by whispers and the occasional noise of the seat belts being pulled. The center of attention was an elderly woman who, despite her trembling hands, tried to maintain her dignity. Her fingers gripped the leather handles of her bag tightly, as if it were the only thing holding her in this moment. The steward pressed his lips together and sighed loudly, as if gathering his strength to make a decisive move. His face was a mixture of irritation and determination, and his voice sounded like a gunshot. "That's all. You're disobeying the rules and disturbing the other passengers. Get off the plane now." The woman looked up, her voice trembling but sounding composed and soft. "Why are you doing this to me? I'm not bothering anyone. I'm just asking for a little respect." These words, imbued with pain and resentment, hung in the air, but the steward did not listen. His tone became even harsher. "You're a troublemaker, ma'am. If you don't come out voluntarily, I'll call security. It's your choice." Several passengers, trying to protest, began to speak at the same time. "This is too much. She hasn't done anything wrong. Why are you treating her like this?" But the steward cut them off abruptly. "Do you have any complaints? Take them to the airline after the flight. I am now responsible for the order on board." The woman rose slowly. Her movements were tense and cautious, as if she were carrying an invisible weight on her shoulders. The stares of the passengers were burning her from all sides. She felt as if she were on trial, where her every move was under close scrutiny. "I'm sorry if I've offended you," she said quietly, looking around the salon. "But what you're doing is wrong. It hurts. It hurts a lot." Her voice shook, and she turned away so that no one would see the tears rolling down her cheeks. She took a few steps toward the exit, but suddenly stopped and turned, addressing the entire cabin. When you allow these things to happen, when you're silent, you become part of it. Silence is also a choice. Her words echoed like thunder in the hearts of many. Some of the passengers lowered their eyes, as if ashamed of their passivity, but most of them remained silent, as if they were afraid of disturbing the already established order. The steward frowned, his tone even more cold. "That's enough. Follow me. We won't wait any longer." She obeyed, though her back remained straight and her steps firm. But there was fear in her eyes, deep, pressing, eating away at her from the inside. Each step toward the exit seemed interminably long. Her bag nearly slipped from her hands, but she didn't let herself drop it, as if it were her last show of strength. As she reached the doors, one of the passengers shouted out, "It's humiliating. It's a disgrace." But their words were drowned in general apathy. No one followed the woman. No one stood up to support her. She stopped at the exit, taking one last look at the salon. There was pain and resentment in her eyes, but even more disappointment. Disappointment in the people who'd chosen to look away. And with that look, heavy, filled with silent condemnation, she disappeared out the door. The cabin fell into tense silence again. The steward returned to his seat, confident that he had restored order, but hardly anyone felt comfortable after that. Outside the windows of the airplane, a woman stood on the empty field of the airfield. Her figure seemed small and fragile against the background of the huge iron plane. She looked into the distance, clutching her bag. Her tears rolling down her cheeks mingled with the bitterness she had carried with her all her life. When the airplane door closed behind the elderly woman, the cabin was plunged into a heavy silence. Only the sound of the air conditioner running and the occasional rustling of passengers broke this oppressive atmosphere. However, this silence was short-lived. "It was disgusting," the woman in the front row said quietly, turning to her neighbors. Her eyes burned with anger. "To treat a human being like that, it's a disgrace." "He was just doing his job," the man across the aisle replied coldly, shrugging his shoulders. "If she can't follow the rules, that's her problem. An airplane is no place for weakness." These words caused an outburst of indignation. The passengers began to chatter, their voices gradually growing louder. "She just asked for help. How could you kick her out for that?" An elderly man from the back row was indignant. "Wasn't it hard to help? Isn't that their responsibility? Have you seen her?" The woman in the business suit replied sharply. "She's been acting defiant from the start. Such behavior only disturbs other passengers. No one has to tolerate it." The arguments erupted like dry brushwood under fire. Everyone tried to express their point of view, and the tension in the cabin was growing with every second. Some passengers had already taken out their phones, recording what was happening, discussing the situation in messengers. Someone was watching a video that he managed to shoot during the conflict. The internet was flooded with comments, but the situation on the airplane was only getting more tense. "Did you hear what he said to her?" A young girl sitting by the window spoke up. "It was pure racism. Pure racism. If you can't see that, then you are part of the problem." "Racism?" The man with the glasses pushed them up on his nose. "Let's not use those big words. She created the problem and he fixed it. If this had gone on much longer, we wouldn't have gotten off on time. He did what he had to do." These words caused a new round of angry objections. Some passengers openly resented the steward's behavior, considering his actions unfair. Others, on the contrary, tried to justify his behavior, referring to the rules and the need to maintain order. "It's not about the rules," the young woman in the brightly colored dress said sharply. "It's about the way he talked to her. He humiliated her in front of everyone. Her eyes. Did you see her eyes?" She was terrified. "Scared?" interrupted her by the man who had earlier defended the steward. "She manipulated everyone, faking it to elicit pity. Why don't you see that?" The girl couldn't stand it. "Pretending? Do you realize what you're saying?" She was in pain and asking for help, and instead she was just thrown away like unwanted baggage. "You all know how to complain," said the woman in the business suit. "People like her are used to having everything handed to them on a platter. That's not the way the world works." The words, "people like her," caused a loud murmur. Several people were openly indignant. "And what do you mean by such?" the man asked with a noticeable accent, squinting his eyes. "Are you saying that her skin color means something?" "I didn't say anything like that." The woman excused herself, but her tone betrayed irritation. With each word, the atmosphere in the cabin became more and more tense. It seemed that the conflict over the woman had only fueled the latent resentments and prejudices among the passengers. People began to talk louder and louder, their voices merging into an unintelligible rumble that came over the cabin like a wave. In the midst of this chaos, the steward tried to maintain a semblance of calmness, although his face betrayed his inner tension. He stepped into the aisle, his voice sharp and commanding. "Gentlemen, calm down. We will not discuss this incident. If anyone has a complaint, you can direct it through the airline's official channels. We are now focusing on ensuring your comfort." But these words only fueled the fire. Passengers began to protest more loudly, some openly accusing the steward of racism, others of being unable to handle conflicts. Every word he said provoked a new outburst of indignation. The airplane cabin, which an hour ago had been filled with people indifferent to each other, now turned into a battlefield of opinions. Unity, even a fleeting one, seemed impossible. Everyone was choosing his side, his truth, and no one was going to back down. But none of them knew that in just a few minutes the news of what had happened would spread outside the airplane, and the story would develop new, even more tragic details. About half an hour had passed since the plane finally took off. The tension in the cabin had not subsided. The passengers were whispering, talking, and glancing disapprovingly at the steward, who seemed to be trying to avoid their glances. But he still felt them, those burning, judgmental glances which made him tense up inwardly. The steward, trying to distract himself, went to the back office to discuss what had happened with his colleagues. He thought he had done the right thing. Rules were rules, and he was only following them. But something in him felt as if he had not been able to rest. The stubborn voice of doubt sounded louder and louder in his head. "Did you see the reaction of the passengers?" said one of the stewardesses, leaning toward him. "It was too much, Tom. We could have handled it differently." "What was I supposed to do?" he snapped back. "Let her act like she was above the rules? Don't make me laugh." At that moment, the door to the service room opened. The pilot looked serious and tense. He held a telephone in his hand. "Tom, we need to talk," he said, looking at the steward with an expression that instantly made him tense up. "Is something wrong?" Tom asked, trying to stay calm. The pilot silently held out his phone to him. A news portal window was open on the screen. The headline and accompanying photo struck Tom like lightning. Airport scandal. Prominent human rights activist Amelia Carter was humiliated aboard an airline flight. The photo attached to the article was clear and unambiguous. The elderly woman he had just kicked off the plane stood in the background of the airport, surrounded by reporters. Her gaze was filled with pain, but her face remained calm and her posture majestic. "What the hell?" Tom whispered, feeling cold sweat break out on his forehead. Amelia Carter? Did that name mean something? The pilot frowned. "Are you kidding me? This is Amelia Carter, Tom, one of the most influential public figures of our time. She fights for the rights of minorities, women, the poor, orphans. Her foundation has changed the lives of millions. This is a woman who's been quoted by presidents, Tom. You just kicked her off an airplane." Tom froze. He felt the world around him begin to crumble. A swirl of thoughts swirled in his head. He remembered her calm voice, her look of hurt and fear, her words, "It hurts. It hurts a lot." Those words sounded very different now. "But," he started to say, but the pilot interrupted him. "News has already started to spread. Video of the incident was taken by several passengers. Everything you said, everything you did is now all over the internet. And, Tom, it looks terrible, really awful." The pilot's words seemed to cut through the air in the room. Tom felt his legs go cotton. Panic began to rise like a tidal wave. It's a mistake," he muttered. "She looked. I didn't know who she was." "It doesn't matter, Tom," the stewardess replied coldly. "Even if she had been an ordinary passenger, your behavior was unacceptable. But now it's more than a conflict. This is a scandal that will ruin your career, and not just yours." At that moment, there was a knock on the door. Another stewardess looked out from around the corner. Her face was dead pale. "We have to do something. Passengers are already discussing who she is. Someone's been reading the news on their phone. They're saying we deliberately humiliated her. People in the cabin are angry." "Great," Tom whispered, feeling his hands begin to tremble. "Just fine." But that wasn't all. A minute later, the office phone rang. Tom picked up the receiver, not immediately realizing that he was answering a voice from the airline's headquarters. The voice sounded furious. "Tom, you have exactly 10 minutes to prepare a formal statement. You must publicly apologize to the passengers. We're trying to contact Mrs. Carter to prevent a disaster. If this gets out of control, the whole company will be in crisis, and you're the one who's going to be on the hook." The words "extreme" sounded like the final blow. Tom felt the ground slipping from under his feet. Events were moving too fast. Just an hour ago, he had been sure that he was right, and now his life was falling apart right before his eyes. But what could he do? The turn of events seemed irreversible, and the shadow of the woman he had thrown out loomed ever larger over him, becoming a symbol of his greatest mistake. Half an hour after the plane gained altitude, the first wave of news had already taken over social media. The incident on board was captured on video by several passengers, and the footage began to spread rapidly. The hashtags #racism on board, #Amelia Carter, and #airline shame started gaining popularity. The footage clearly showed the steward raising his voice at the elderly woman, whose posture and dignity only emphasized the contrast between her and his rudeness. The final moment, when he orders her to leave the plane, caused a flurry of emotions in the audience. "How is this even acceptable in 2024?" one Twitter user wrote. "All she did was ask for help, and she was humiliated in front of everyone. It's not just unprofessional, it's racist. This is Amelia Carter. A person who saved thousands of lives, and you treat her like this? Shame on you." Commentators from different parts of the world started to pick up the theme. The video went viral on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. The publications were accompanied by words of condemnation, outrage, and calls to boycott the airline. Avalanche effect. By the time the plane reached its cruising altitude, the situation on the ground was already out of control. The media picked up the story. The headlines sounded like verdicts. Scandal on board. Prominent human rights activist Amelia Carter subjected to racist humiliation. The airline has found itself at the center of a racist scandal. The Amelia Carter incident. Society demands justice. Major news outlets began publishing biographies of Amelia Carter, emphasizing her accomplishments. She was a person who fought for the rights of the underprivileged, worked in hotspots, rescued orphans, and built schools in poor regions. Her name was synonymous with humanity, fortitude, and justice. How could they not know who she is? Commenters wrote angrily. But even if she wasn't famous, it's still unacceptable. The fact that Amelia Carter, a symbol of the fight against racism and inequality, was herself a victim of humiliation in full view of everyone resonated particularly strongly. Her face, captured in photographs at the airport, restrained but full of pain, became a symbol of the scandal. Inside the airplane, the public outcry reached the passengers of the airplane. Those who had previously argued about what had happened now started checking their phones, reading news and comments. "Jesus," muttered the man who had earlier justified the steward's actions. "I've just found out who she is. It's Amelia Carter. I read about her. Her foundation helps orphans in Africa. She's an incredible woman." "You see," flashed the girl in the brightly colored dress, "and you said she was manipulative. What do you say now?" Some passengers began to openly express outrage. They shared information, discussed the video, and demanded explanations. "That steward should apologize," an elderly woman from the front row said loudly. "And not just him. The airline has to comment on this." "Do you realize this is going to be a disaster?" muttered the man with the laptop, turning to his neighbor. "Their stock will plummet. It's an international scandal." There were demands among the passengers to contact airline representatives directly from on board. The anticipation grew like the thunder before the storm. People began to share their thoughts in their voices, and the discussions became more and more emotional. On board, the crew, Steward Tom sat in the service room, his face dead pale. The phone he held in his hands vibrated non-stop. The messages from management were becoming more and more disturbing. "The video is already in the news. You're the center of attention. Prepare a public apology. That's an order. We're trying to minimize the damage, but the situation is out of control." Tom could feel the sweat running down his back. His confidence in the rightness of his actions dissolved completely under the weight of the realization. He was not just a participant in the conflict, he had become the face of it. "This is a disaster," one of the flight attendants said quietly. "Tom, do you realize that this isn't just your behavior anymore? It's a reflection on the entire company, and we're being dragged into this scandal too." "Yeah, I was just following the rules," he mumbled, as if trying to justify himself. "I didn't know who she was. I didn't know—" "It doesn't matter," she interrupted sharply. "You insulted her in front of everyone. Even if she had been an ordinary woman, it would have been wrong. And now it's Amelia Carter. It's a worldwide scandal, Tom." World reaction. At that time, a real storm was unfolding on social media. Thousands of users demanded Tom's dismissal and a public apology from the airline. Some called for a boycott of the airline, while others posted stories of similar incidents, turning the situation into a symbol of the fight against injustice and racism. But among the floods of criticism came those who defended the crew, saying it was all exaggerated. Maybe she really did break the rules. Why did she even bring up that luggage? Every situation is turning racist now. Let's look objectively. However, such voices were quickly drowned in a wave of outrage. People demanded justice for Amelia Carter. The scandal continued to grow, threatening to go beyond a simple conflict to become a symbol of a global problem of bias and injustice. None of the participants realized how far this story would go, but one thing was certain: their lives would never be the same again. An hour after takeoff, the atmosphere on board the airplane was heated to the max. The voices of the passengers were getting louder and the discussions more and more acrimonious. Some openly expressed indignation at the crew, while others silently followed the news on their phones, waiting to see how events would unfold. In the service room, the crew gathered for an emergency meeting. Steward Tom's face was dead pale, his hands trembling. He tried to calm down, but each message from the airline management only increased his panic. The last one read, "She has to get back on board. Immediately. Do whatever is necessary to smooth things over." "Are we going to get her back?" one of the stewardesses asked incredulously. After everything that had happened, how would she even agree? "She's already agreed," the pilot said as he entered the room. His face was stony, his voice firm. "Management has contacted her through a representative. She will be taken back to the plane through a special entrance. We've been ordered to apologize and make her as comfortable as possible." "It's impossible," Tom began, but the pilot interrupted him abruptly. "You realize what's at stake here, don't you? If she comes on board and we don't handle this situation, it will be the end not only of your career, but of our company." The return of Amelia Carter. 20 minutes later, the plane returned to the parking lot to pick up Amelia Carter. The woman, despite pressure from the press, had agreed to return, but not because of the airline's offers. Her motives were deeper. She knew that her presence on board would be a symbolic step, a call to fight the injustice she had witnessed. When she stepped on board, accompanied by the airline representative, the cabin froze. All eyes were fixed on her figure. Her posture was straight, but her face was tired, yet her gaze was firm, the gaze of a person who was not going to be silent. The crew met her in the aisle. Tom stood in front, avoiding her eyes. His heart was beating so loudly that he could barely hear himself think. Finally, he took a step forward and squeezed out, "Madam Carter, on behalf of the crew and the company, I want to express my deepest apologies. What happened is unacceptable, and I take full responsibility." His voice shook, his words sounded unconvincing, strained. The woman looked at him with cold calmness, but she said nothing. Her silence spoke more than any words. It cut through the air, making the passengers and crew feel even more uncomfortable. "We want you to know," one of the stewardesses intervened, "that we are deeply sorry for what happened. Please accept our sincere remorse." Amelia Carter raised her hand, gesturing to stop further apologies. Her voice was quiet, but there was strength in it. "Regret? Sincere? You want me to believe that now, after everything that's happened? After I've been publicly humiliated? After you turned your back when all I did was ask for help?" Tom tried to say something, but she wouldn't let him continue. "Your words are just words. They mean nothing because your actions speak for you. You didn't apologize when it really mattered. You made your choice." The passengers froze. Some were recording her words on their phones, others just sat in tense silence. "I didn't come back here to hear you apologize," Amelia continued, looking directly at Tom. "I came back because I can't let your behavior go unchallenged. People need to know how they are welcomed aboard this airline. They need to know what it means to be human in your world of rules." Her words hit like a hammer. Tom felt the ground slipping from under his feet. He wanted to answer, to justify himself, but he couldn't get a word out. Further humiliation. The crew escorted Amelia Carter to a seat in first class, giving her the best accommodations, but she would not accept any offer. When offered food and drink, she refused, only adding quietly, "My place here is temporary, but your reputation will stay with you forever." The passengers began to applaud, cheering her on. The gesture further widened the gap between her and the crew. Tom felt a wave of condemnation wash over him. He wanted to disappear, to leave the plane, but he was chained to his seat, aware that his every move, every word was now under scrutiny. Echoes of events. The flight continued, but the silence in the cabin was oppressive. Amelia sat still, her posture straight, but her presence was felt in every corner of the airplane. The shadow of her humiliation hung over all who witnessed it. Her return was an act of confrontation that no one could ignore. No one knew how far this scandal would go, but one thing was certain. The story of Amelia Carter and her fight against injustice would long rumble in the news and in the hearts of those who witnessed it. Amelia Carter sat in her chair, staring out the window at the vast sky beyond. But her thoughts were far away from that peaceful landscape. Everything that had happened came back to life in her mind. The steward's shrill words, the humiliation in front of everyone, the looks of the passengers, some with pity, some with indifference. Her heart ached not so much for the incident itself, but for the fact that this was more than just a personal insult. It was a symptom of a larger problem, one she'd been struggling with all her life. "It can't go on like this," she told herself quietly but firmly. When the plane finally landed, Amelia quickly left, rebuffing any attempts by the crew to detain her for further apologies. She realized that words spoken out of fear for her reputation meant nothing. Instead, she made her way to the waiting driver who had been called ahead of time by her assistants. "Contact our lawyers immediately," she said as she got into the car, "and prepare a statement for the press. I won't let this incident go under the radar." Communications with lawyers. A few hours later, Amelia sat in the spacious office of her legal team. Her lawyers were experienced people, used to high-profile cases, but even they looked shocked to hear their client's story. "This is a blatant violation of rights," said the chief lawyer, reviewing the videos and photos that were already going viral on social media. "We're not just talking about personal insults. There are issues of discrimination, racism, and disorderly conduct involved here." "We'll sue," Amelia said firmly. "But I need more than that. This isn't just a case against the airline. This is a matter of public opinion. We need to use this moment to show people that this will not be tolerated." The lawyers nodded. They realized that this case went far beyond the court. It was meant to be an example to all. Press statement. The next morning, Amelia Carter appeared before the cameras. Her face was calm, but her voice sounded firm and determined. "Yesterday, I witnessed the discrimination and bias that continues to exist in our society. This is not only an insult to me as an individual, it is an attack on anyone who has ever experienced injustice. I cannot and will not remain silent." Her statement was short but powerful. She did not threaten, She did not directly accuse, but her words denounced the system. Her message sent a message to millions of people who felt victimized by this injustice. Public outcry, the world's reaction was instantaneous. Her words instantly went viral on social media and in the media. News of her statement became the center of attention on all major TV channels and news portals. Hashtags that started gaining popularity on the day of the incident have now become a symbol of a global movement. Amelia Carter is back on the front lines of the fight for justice. The truth must be heard. Carter opens a new front. Scandal is in the air. The public is demanding change. She was supported by millions of people. On social networks, posts began to appear with stories of unfair treatment, of the discrimination people faced in their lives. Amelia became a symbol. Her name became a banner of struggle again. Pressing the airline in turn found itself in the midst of a crisis. The management tried to quell the scandal by issuing an official apology. We deeply regret what happened and express our sincere apologies to Ms. Carter. We have launched an internal investigation to understand how this could have happened. But this was not enough. Passengers on board began to tell their versions of events, confirming that the steward had not only violated professional norms, but had also shown blatant rudeness and bias. The company's shares began to fall. Activists organized protests outside the airline's offices in several cities, demanding immediate changes in their policies and the dismissal of all those involved in the incident. Amelia's interview. A few days later, Amelia gave an exclusive interview to a major international TV channel. She talked about what had happened, but her emphasis was not on personal resentment, but on the need for change. "This is not just my story," she said. "It's the story of thousands, millions of people who face injustice every day but can't be heard. We have to change that. We have to fight for a society where everyone feels respected." Her words caused a flurry of emotions. People cried, commented, shared her interview, and public pressure on the airline continued to grow. The beginning of change. After Amelia's statement, the airline announced sweeping changes, new training for employees, a review of internal policies, and the creation of an anti-discrimination committee. Steward Tom was fired, but that didn't stop public pressure. People demanded not just punishment, but transformation of the entire system. Amelia Carter, meanwhile, continued to work with lawyers and activists, turning her pain into a tool for the struggle. Her goal was clear: to make sure that no one else had to go through what she had gone through. Amelia Carter's story became more than just another scandal. It became a movement for justice, a sign that even in the darkest of situations, you can find the power for change. And that was just the beginning. Tom sat in his small rental house, surrounded by a silence that was becoming more and more oppressive. His phone vibrated endlessly. Notifications, messages, calls. Most he didn't even open, knowing that behind them lurked another wave of anger. Social media, news headlines, even his own email became a battleground where he was the central target. His face, his voice, it all became a symbol of a scandal that swelled to global proportions. Memes, angry comments, video analysis, the internet turned him into a caricature of evil. People discussed him, his words, his tone, trying to make sense of every moment of the incident that was a disaster for his life. In the first week after the event, Tom still tried to defend himself. He wrote to acquaintances, explaining that he was just doing his job, following the rules. But this only increased the criticism. He was told, What rules? Rules to humiliate an elderly woman? Rules about being racist? The airline's management organized an emergency internal investigation. First, he received a call from representatives of the HR department. Their tone was cold and official. "Tom, we need to discuss the situation. Management wants an explanation. Why did you make the decision to pull Ms. Carter off the flight?" His explanations sounded unconvincing even to himself. With each question, he realized more and more that he would not be able to justify himself. What he perceived as following procedures turned out to be a bias that he would not be able to hide behind. He was reminded of the passengers' complaints, which confirmed his aggression and dismissive attitude. A few days later, he was informed that he was suspended. It was the beginning of the end. Unemployment, public anger, threats, it all came down on him in an avalanche. His co-workers refused to comment. Many avoided socializing to avoid being embroiled in the scandal. Even friends began to distance themselves. They did not want to be associated with a man whose name had become a symbol of systemic injustice. He was recognized on the streets. First, it was slanted glances, then direct accusations. Once in a store, someone threw it in his face. "Are you that steward?" "Shame on you. I hate people like you." Those words rang louder than any headlines. He began avoiding public places, stopped answering his cell phone, and shut down his social media accounts. His family, who lived in another state, was also attacked. His parents received dozens of threatening letters. His younger sister received insults from classmates. His mother cried while calling him on the phone. "What did you do, Tom? Why did this happen? We can't live in peace anymore." Every night, Tom fell asleep under the weight of a growing sense of guilt. He dreamed of her eyes, full of pain and reproach, the look that had haunted him ever since she'd left the plane. He woke up in a cold sweat with a rumbling feeling of emptiness in his chest. Sometimes he tried to justify himself. "I was just doing my job. She's the one who made a drama out of it." But even those thoughts didn't bring relief. The press continued to inflate the story. He was portrayed as a man who embodied the worst of society: indifference, prejudice, rudeness. His act became a symbol of a system that rejects the weak, humiliates the vulnerable, and justifies those who violate their rights. One day, he was called for an interview to give him a chance to explain himself. He hesitated, but agreed, hoping to at least partially remedy his situation. But the interview was a disaster. He tried to explain that he didn't know who Amelia Carter was, that his actions were dictated by stress and fatigue, but the journalist didn't give him a chance. "Even if it was just an elderly woman," the presenter said, "didn't she deserve respect? Your behavior doesn't reflect just a mistake. It reflects your attitude. How can you justify it?" He had nothing to answer. The interview, instead of softening the criticism, only made things worse. Now his words were discussed as much as his actions. By the end of the month, Tom had completely lost confidence in the future. His name was blacklisted by airlines, none of which wanted to deal with a man whose face was associated with a high-profile scandal. He had to think about changing his profession, but it was difficult. His reputation had spread beyond the airline industry. Every day was a new struggle for him. But the hardest part wasn't the social stigma. It was what he couldn't forget. He couldn't forget her words. "Your actions speak louder than words." And they did. They spoke louder about him and his mistakes than he could have imagined. Several months passed, but the scars of the incident remained on everyone who was connected to the story in one way or another. The airline continued to lose the trust of passengers. Their claims of internal reforms and commitments to stand up to discrimination were seen as a belated attempt to save their reputation. But behind the words were real changes. Revamped crew training programs, mandatory diversity and inclusion training, and tough policies on biased behavior. For Amelia Carter, this story was not just a struggle for her own dignity, but a new chapter in her mission. She launched a campaign to call international attention to the systemic bias and humiliation faced by people around the world. Her public speeches, articles, and interviews have inspired millions of people, empowering them to share their stories and demand change. At one such event, Amelia stood on stage in front of a huge audience. Her voice was calm but firm, like a steel blade. This case was just a reflection of what millions of people face every day. Injustice, bias, indifference, these are not just mistakes of individuals. It is a disease of our system, of our society. We must all be responsible for its cure. Her words were met with a round of applause. She knew her mission was just beginning, but this step was necessary to open people's eyes. Her voice became the voice of those who had long been denied the right to be heard. What about Tom? After losing his job and ruining his reputation, he moved to another city, trying to escape the oppressive reality. But he couldn't forget the story. At night, he dreamed of that scene on the plane, her eyes full of pain, the judgment of the passengers, his own voice sounding in his ears like an accusation. Slowly, he began to realize that it wasn't just fatigue or stress that had caused everything. It was his inability to see the other person as an equal. A year after the incident, Tom showed up unexpectedly at one of Amelia's events. He stood in line for a long time to talk to her. When his turn came, she looked up. Her face expressed no anger, only tired understanding. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he began, looking into her eyes, "because I know it's not enough. But I would like to say that I realize how blind I was, and I'm trying to change." Amelia looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded and answered quietly, "Understanding is the first step, but change begins with action. Do better. It's the only way to correct mistakes." That conversation was a turning point for Tom. He started working for a local charity organization, helping people in difficult circumstances. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could try to make the future better. The story of Amelia Carter and her confrontation with injustice has been remembered by society as a powerful reminder that respect and equality are not just pretty words. It is a daily choice that each of us makes. This story showed that even one incident can be a catalyst for change if we are not afraid to speak up and demand justice. And it was a lesson that cannot be forgotten. Friends, this story touched on very important topics that concern each of us. We want to know your opinion. What do you think about it? Have you ever experienced injustice or discrimination in your life? Share your stories in the comments. Your opinion is very important to us, and every voice counts. If you are close to this topic and want to support us, don't forget to give us a like and subscribe to the channel. We appreciate each and every one of you and strive to create content that helps us all become better people. We wish you a good day filled with respect and kindness. Thank you for being with us.